So, welcome everybody to today's podcast episode of Pathways. And today I have with me Karoliina Sandstrom. And Karoliina Sandstrom, she is a mindful embodiment guide and she holds a PhD in psychophysical actor training. And she's also a mother, right? And you are much more than what I just described. So I would truly welcome you, and I'm happy that you're here with me today and with my listeners. And I look forward to talking to you. And if you want to say something more about yourself and introduce yourself more fuller, please go ahead. Amazing. So start telling me about what does it mean to be a mindful embodiment guide?
So, for me, the way that I come to working with embodiment is often with people who are interested in sort of some area where they would like to develop their skills. So, sometimes we speak about certain emotional states or kind of areas where they know that they could have a different response, but they're not quite sure how to get there. And I have a long-standing mindfulness practice through my theater work and my teaching also, um, and meditation practice. So I guess the perspective that I bring to an exploration like that partly is very informed by certain philosophical principles
Mhm.
around what embodiment might be, but not in terms necessarily of we would look at, the physiological aspects of embodiment. How does the nervous system work? What are the kind of states that we might find ourselves in that might be related to the vagal nerve system? But also just what it means to become more and more grounded into what our experience is. Oftentimes, as we all face this human experience, we are kind of faced with perhaps something we find we don't like. That's often where we start. But the very nature of mindfulness asks us to look at something not from a position of trying to have an opinion about it, whilst it still recognizes the fact that it's uncomfortable. So I don't think it's wrong to say I wish I could deal with my experience of anger in a more constructive way. I think it's okay to dislike the human aspect of that. But if we are going to approach that from a mindfulness perspective, we are not looking to apply a set strategy to solve the problem. We are looking to explore based on what our current understanding of the body is, our current articulation of the problem, what we actually are thinking about that issue, what is our state of being as we contemplate the issue. So we're trying to bring ourselves really into the moment of being with what is. And from there, often, as I'm sure you have had your own experiences and you can recognize already what patterns and what paradigms I'm using, from that bringing in the problem sometimes isn't the problem. And the solution is much closer at hand, if you like, for the person. And we begin to create understandings which allow us to develop our own presence in the experience and therefore our embodiment of the human mess.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, the human mess. I like that a lot, and there's so much here that we could tap into and continue to talking about. So let me ask you then, just to continue this conversation on this topic. So yeah, I can recognize that once you that you are able to be you always are in a certain state, right? You always are in a certain state. And it's not certain that you're aware of that. And that can be because you're not trained in learning to recognize your own states. It's maybe you don't have the language to understand, even if you recognize something, you don't understand, right? So there are different layers here that I hear you. The first step would be perhaps to first identify or to first come into the present moment. So how can one do that? Like what's the step by step process that you usually use with your clients when you work with them?
Well, see, this is really interesting because for me, I'm aware that this is a kind of way in which people find. I could give you some process, but the whole part of the way that I approach the interaction is that it's an arising moment. So I myself, in the moment as I am there with the person, I'm working on being in that present moment. And I am working on placing my attention on what is there then. And that informs the session. So when somebody writes to me and fills in the questionnaire and expresses their kind of questions and what they're after and what they're interested in, I always contemplate it and I write it up and I gather my toolkits of ideas. But very rarely do I use that. I very rarely actually use my notes for the person. Why? Because there are principles of work, but then the practical applications of those principles will look different every time. So in that sense, like, I would love to answer your question, and I guess what the answer is in many ways is that I would prepare something, but the whole nature of being an embodied mindfulness coach is that a lot of the work really, or a lot of the interchange, is actually happening through the state of being that oneself inhabits. And the capacity that we have through mirror neurons and all of this to begin to expand or recognize within ourselves sort of a new perspective or landscape. So if I come to a session simply in a certain state of being, which is not something that I decide, this is not a mental question, this is a question of practice, the transformation or the development of the person's process is partly happening through the very nature of the interaction. Because if I go into a session with somebody who wants to work on anger and I come in and I give them lots of solutions and I might send them off thinking that now they can just apply these things and they should change. But that's very rarely the case, because it's not, we can read a lot of books, but it's very different to have an approach, an embodied approach to those ideas. And partly this is why we all need guides and teachers who are further than us on the road, because what we are receiving is their words or their ideas or their perspectives. But very importantly, we are receiving the opportunity to be in a space with somebody who has a nervous system that's gone through practice and experiences, and we can get to learn from that nervous system.
Yeah.
And so one big part of the being a guide is perhaps even just the way that we respond to the person's problem. Already that, well, problem in quotes, already just the way we're responding is an interchange of information about how to begin to look at the question. So a very non-answer.
No, it's a wonderful answer, and what I can discern is bifurcation in one sense, because this is, and you're a PhD, I'm a PhD, and something that I worked on a lot in my own thinking as I was doing my PhD was the differentiation between theory and practice.
Yeah.
It's a huge one.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very important one, right? And what you're saying is basically this. This is how I understand you. If I am to mirror you, is that you can have theories about embodiment. You can have theories about the nervous system. You can learn everything about the vagus nerve and and the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system and all these tools and practices on how to do it. But learning about them is completely different from actually doing it, from doing the work. It's a different experience. And in reality is such, in my understanding, that the practice is ontologically different from the theory, because you can never capture the practice fully and completely with the theory. And this is something that, like, scholars such as, in the field of phenomenology,
Mm-hmm.
that's something that Merleau-Ponty, for example, he
Yeah.
discovered, right, in his work, and there were others as well.
Yeah.
For example, I forget the name of this sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu, for example. Also,
Mm-hmm.
he
Mm-hmm.
talks about the differentiation between the social field and then the practice, the field of
Yeah.
practice.
Yeah.
And I remember when I was working, reading Bourdieu and thinking about what he was saying, and it was basically to say there is an ontological gap between theory and practice, which means that they're completely different fields.
Yeah.
There's no absolutely they have, you try with your words, with your rational thoughts, with your papers that you write, to try to
Mm-hmm.
describe an aspect of reality. But
Mm-hmm.
the truth is that reality is, in its essence, very different or completely different from the theory. But
Mm-hmm.
again, there is a link between the two at the same time, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
because they're not completely different, they're distinct, because your knowledge about the practices does inform your practice,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the
Yes.
theoretical knowledge does inform your practice.
Yeah.
So what do you think? Is this something that you have been thinking about, or is this part of your own personal experience? Or
Well, as a performer and as a researcher, as somebody who's a scholar, I always, during my PhD, I always said to people like, "Oh, I don't think I want to be an academic. This is the vehicle. This is a vehicle for me to perform. Like I'm practicing and then finding maps which can explain my experiences and deepen them." So for me, it's always been about like, I guess my obsession would have always been like, what is going on? What is this thing? And how, and also, I've had the luck of meeting very early on in my kind of academic life some really, really great teachers, some really extraordinary teachers. And therefore, the models of embodiment have been quite particular. And these teachers, in different ways, have facilitated for me like very deep, transformative experiences, which come out of my changing, my thinking, and my embodiment. So for me, it's like if we're to talk philosophy, I go very quickly to Metaphors We Live By, Johnson and
mm-hmm,
Lakoff,
mm-hmm,
Philosophy in the Flesh. And I like to keep those in mind always, those kinds of books for me, because they just point to the way in which language is embodied. It is not unembodied. And all of the ways that we express through language are ways we can express because we have a body. And at the same time, I also feel that we are very lucky humans because we have an opportunity to engage with writing by people who have been obsessed about something and who have, through their obsession, created massive bodies of work that can serve us as we create our own maps. But all of those maps, all practices even, they are really vehicles which can serve us to go beyond them. But we have an opportunity to first engage with knowledge, with material that explains some of the ways in which we may think that we work. And as we engage with those ways of thinking about our experience, naturally, we will begin to observe our experience differently. And I think that for me, the exciting thing, I mean, I love study, I love reading, I feel like I live in a library, and I would quite happily own a bookshop. But really, I love study because of how it changes me. Because when I engage with ideas, I get to have empowered positions of changing my relationship to my experience. And that, in my personal experience, has brought me freedom. Freedom
Mm.
from rigid structures, freedom from paradigms and beliefs, freedom from a lot of things that were unconscious until I engaged in the study of knowledge. But I guess I have always pursued. So I have always pursued knowledge because of what I experience. It has always had that purpose of going, I don't understand this, or this was really cool, what's going on, or like, this feels always very uncomfortable. I have a lot of dis-ease. Let's look at what this thing is, what people say about it. And the more, like Socrates, my experience is, on the one hand, that the more we study, I mean, we just realize we're not going to get through the stuff, right? Like one lifetime doesn't have a chance of getting through the stuff. And at the same time, it becomes more and more clear that many structures have limitations. So as we engage with more and more and more models, we can begin to see, yeah, it is a vehicle. Because this model allowed me to look at, the cognitive nature of my thinking and how it's related to how I feel. But it doesn't, this is just one piece of a puzzle. And I think that's something that I bring to the work because I came to all of it from a secular comparative study position. I came to all of what I've studied as a performer originally. I didn't come to spiritual studies because I pursued a spiritual life. I didn't come to psychology because I wanted to be a psychologist. I didn't come to neuroscience because I want to work in a lab. I always came to it from what are we doing on stage? What does it mean to be human? What are emotions? How come if I'm a performer and I'm able to create all these mind structures and active structures of living an experience, how is this different, if it's different, to what I live in my life? And if I have power here to create reality, surely I have power here. Are these the same principles of creation?
Do you think that there is a, would you be able to describe, or do you agree with the statement that the reality is, or our practical reality can be pre-rational, pre-language? So is our experience always, like the embodied experience that we have, is there always a thought, or is there always a rational thought involved in that? Or do we have a pre-rational, pre-narrative experience?
Okay, so you're using the word narrative and rational.
Yeah.
It's like, so could we say the discursive mind? Would
Yeah,
that be
that's better.
a good
Absolutely.
description? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So, well, yeah, I mean, we all know, I'm sure you've had a moment in your life when you've been very scared. Like, I was about 20. I was coming home at 5 a.m. in the morning. I hadn't been at party, but I happened to be getting a ride at 5 a.m. And I walked like over a little hill down to my house. And there was a mother moose on the hill with her two little babies. It was very dark, and I didn't see her until she was charging at me. Like 800 kilos, angry mother moose coming boom, 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 boom at me. And before I knew it, I was in a bush. Like I have no recollection of going into the bush. And it's interesting, I got scared once I was in the bush, but that whole split second thing, it was automatic. So clearly that's I was that was my sympathetic system saving my life. It went.
Mhm.
So we know that there is things that happen to us pre-discursively. Like there are systems in us that work without the necessity of the discursive mind. And we also know that there are like 1.3 billion bits of information that gets into like between 30 and 100 bits get to consciousness. So depending on how we look at the system, we can ask that question. Because if we look at the system like, what is thinking? Is it brain activity? Is it thinking when messages are sent to direct the body? Or when the body sends messages to the mind or to the brain to analyze states? Are these states of thinking? Are these actions of thinking? Are these the kinds of activities that we could consider thinking? So if we look at it that way, there's lots of stuff going on without our having to use our mind. And in fact, our mind could never run the system. It could, I mean, we can't deal with a billion bits of information, right?
Sure.
So in that sense, my answer is kind of technical, actually.
Mm.
And then I think that if we look at some of the accounts, we may have some personal experience of altered states of consciousness. It's clear that there is a lot of potential to how we might experience the present moment. It is clear that there is enough evidence of people transforming their experience of the present moment that we know that we have a system that is able to operate from a different place. There are monks who can sit and have very loud noises happen right next to their ear, but they don't go into fight, flight, fear, or fight, flight, fawn, or freeze, because they have developed, cultivated such strength in their ability to remain in sympathetic states that their system no longer runs the kind of automatic program that saved me from the moose. So my answer to that would be that we have great potential. We have great potential for different kinds of ways of embodiment, and this is part of my passion for working with these ideas, because not because I just think it's exciting, actually.
So that piece of information, namely that our brains or our systems, they take in so much information, but only a small piece of that information is processed or reaches our conscious experience. When I listen to that and I hear that, it means that how you design your life, what you expose yourself to, can have a huge impact on you. And most of the impact that you have, or most of your experience, is actually impacted by the information that gets to you that you're not even aware of. So if you want to, for example, let's say I'm asking you an explicit question. Let's say I want to be in a state of focus where I'm building something consciously. It could be a project, it could be writing a book, it could be building this podcast, it could be anything, like any project that requires my focus for a longer period of time. And I want to make sure that, the information that I'm fed that's not doesn't reach my conscious mind is of the best nature, is it's good quality, so that I'm not stifled by what reaches me. What would you say to a person like that? Like to me, for example.
Well, I would begin, like, we won't probably do it now, but I would actually ask you a lot of questions, you know, because things that affect, again, another another anecdote. In about 2000, and I came across somebody. I was living in Mexico, and I came across a teacher who was teaching about how to eat in such a way that you alkaline your system. And at that time, this was a really interesting thing to me, because I'd already engaged in Ayurveda, in combination diet. I'd done a lot of different things, because in my early 20s, I had difficulties with my stomach. So I'd already tried, and I had already got experience. And then there was this person, and he was actually an ex-student of Osho. So he was a very interesting character. And so I went to take a sort of a weekend course with him, learned lots of really interesting stuff, and above all, I engaged in a 14-day change of diet kind of thing. It was like a detox, but actually you ate loads and loads, and it was all about how to get just really the body to become alkaline. And about 9 days in, I was walking on the campus of Mexico City's one of the biggest universities, and I couldn't feel my body. I couldn't feel my body. It disappeared, but it disappeared as if it was made out of air, like an
Mm.
incredible sense of lightness. And it was wonderful. It was a wonderful moment, and I kind of went, wow. I had never until that point experienced what it feels like when the body has this optimal state of being really having received nutrients, being able to detox naturally, and to be in a state of alkalinity. So the reason I tell you this story is that you're talking about focus, right? And I think something like that, again, I would approach it from looking at it in very, very many different fields and asking a lot of questions. Because we can look at flow theory, by
Mhm.
Csikszentmihalyi, which is fabulous. But if you have acid stomach, that's gonna interfere. Like there's not
Which is part of the information that you expose yourself to, right?
right.
Yeah.
So it's like so again, I think it's very individual, and it's also about because we have when we work with people, it's really about looking at like where are we starting? Like where are we starting? What are the kind of things that this person would be willing to try, and then creating a very probably, very against the kind of I'm going to give you 7 things and it's going to be resolved sort of approach, but kind of going, okay, we're going to do the smallest step and then we'll do another and we'll build this in a way that's sustainable for your nervous system. We're going to face a lot of shadow stuff because resistance is part of the work, you know. And if we just continue to take these steps, this is going to be achieved. But we will not take the bulldozer approach of going, here's your 7 steps, do them, and it's solved. Because that, for me, that kind of approach, it's not really integral to how we tend to work. And when we work with the nervous system, small steps, small consistent steps have been shown overwhelmingly to be much more sustainable because the nervous system doesn't, well, I mean, I've done cold water immersion, so so there's great things to be obtained from like going in for a really big show. It's absolutely fantastic. But actually, at this point in my life, it's like, well, maybe we can go for a much longer period and then change much more significantly, because, well, I don't know, the research kind of shows that that's the sustainable version of change.
Yeah. Because when I work with my clients, something that I'm very, very careful about
Mm.
is to make sure that they're not overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Because if you get overwhelmed, then you won't get anything done. Like you activate your the sympathetic nervous system, and you get into this. Okay, this is too much. It's whether it's lack of focus, whether it's confusion, whether it's a free state or anxiety, as in a fight or flight kind of thing.
Yeah.
So sometimes we want a lot. Like I've noticed that like sometimes we want so much, but our nervous system is not
Yeah.
it's not ready for it. So there's a disconnect between our conscious desires and goals, and then our actual ability to muster the changes.
Yeah.
And often, like there are two kinds of people. No, well, that's a very big simplification, but in my experience, like you can either have huge goals and then your nervous system is completely not ready for those for you to be able to do them in the time frame that you think that you're able to. Right? Rather, you have to have small steps. And I'm experiencing this momentarily right now when I'm training for a marathon, for example. And
Mm-hmm.
then there are also some people that I've noticed that they're accepting the fact that they are in a fight or flight situation. This is how life is. So they
Mm.
don't, because they have tried to change and they have not been able to make the changes that they want, and so they give up.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, okay, this is how life is.
Yeah, right.
Something that I'm very interested in learning about or hearing you talk about is I know that you work in acting, right? And you
Hmm.
train actors and yourself as well. And for actors, it's extremely important to be able to enter different states,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's the
Yeah.
job.
So, yeah, that's the job, right? To enter different states.
Yeah.
So tell me, like how does that work? Like, how do you work with actors? How do you yourself work to, let's say, enter different kinds? What kind of states are there first, and then how do you like? How can you learn, train yourself, teach yourself to enter different states?
Yeah. So, well, I guess for performance, you might be, if you have a varied career, you will be asked to do all the states,
Mm-hmm.
all the different kinds of states. And there's a nice way to approach this. So we know, I think it's William James who asked the question, you're in the woods and you see a bear. So which one of these two options do we think is true? You see the bear, you run, you get scared, or you see the bear, you get scared, you run. So do you have a preference or
So
anything
if
to?
I see the bear and I run or I don't run. Is that the
No.
question?
So
Sorry.
again, sorry, I wasn't clear. So this is the first option. You see the bear, you run, you get scared. The
Hmm.
second option is you see the bear, you get scared, and then you run.
The first, I think.
Okay, so you see the bear, you run, and then you get scared.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that certainly was when I had my moose encounter, that was my experience of it. But in acting, that model sort of works like this. So if we take the first model, I see the bear, I take the action, I have the feeling. That's one pathway.
Hmm.
So I become very good at creating the action in my body, which will provoke the feeling, right? And the second pathway is I know the situation, I create the thinking, the action will reflect
Mm.
the thinking. So it may not be one or the other, but these are two kind of standard pathways of that training. So that answers very simply the training of that
Yeah.
practice in performance.
Yeah.
And different people do both. There's a variety of ways to use
So do
those.
you use so do you use visualization? Sorry, visualization as a path. Like if you want to, let's say you're working on a scene where you want to enter the state of I'm afraid, for example. Is it your
Okay.
visualization you use or?
Well, so let's say, because again we could talk about like a very traditional kind of play where we have characters and storylines and background and future and all this stuff. So in that kind of a performance, what would be used a lot is the story of the character. So what would be used a lot is like this character is so old, they have had these life experiences, their quality of relationship with their mother is such and such, and in this scene I really want my mother to respond to me by giving me this money, but I'm going to try to manipulate her because she has said no so there's lots and lots and lots of that kind of information that when it's held in consciousness, it affects the system, right?
Mm.
But then the other thing is exactly that, like, what is the quality of movement of somebody who knows they're about to manipulate someone? How does that feel? What's the color of that in the body? What's the sensation of it in the mouth? See? And it's like this. Do you have a favorite sweet bread, like, you know, like a donut, or do you have anything like this? Do you have a favorite?
Yeah,
Yeah,
cinnamon bun.
a cinnamon bun.
Yeah.
Right. It's
Mm-hmm.
delicious, right? Yeah, I like the sugar. Does it have sugar on top?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay. What's your mouth doing right now?
Yeah, it's watering.
Yeah, we don't have a
Exactly.
bun, right? Neither of us,
No.
but it's watering. Yeah,
Yeah.
because that relation, and this is really interesting as well when we start to look at something like anger in our personal life, is that the moment that we engage in certain kinds of thinking about something, our body is already with us, you know, and the same thing goes the other way. When allowed, I have kind of high sensitivity in my ears. So if there's lots of loud noises or very sudden loud noise, my system will go into fight and flight, you know. So what we look at, like I come from it from performance. So my understanding of it is kind of pragmatic, but it's the same thing that applies to understanding how I may have a relationship to my body, where I understand that a loud noise, I can start to have a different relationship and a different level of reaction to loud noises. If I start to do exercises and expose myself and write about it, talk about, journal, like there's so many ways I can work with that. And again, of change,
Mm.
because it's huge. None of us are in a prison we cannot break out of, because it's a prison we created ourselves. And that's okay. I don't mean it to be a negative thing, but it's like, as long as I'm not challenging my ideas, my immediate reactions, then I'm in a prison. And that's okay as well. Some things, there are so many things in life. We will be on this path for a long time, but none of us are without the ability to empower ourselves. And
Yeah,
that's nice.
that's nice.
That's exciting.
Yeah, I'm thinking about what you said earlier in the conversation about, but when you're allowing yourself, when you're working with somebody to guide you, you're working with somebody who is more experienced in regulating their own nervous system and who have gone through these states
Mm,
and are aware of their body, the cues in the body. They are able to identify where they are right now, what's going on within,
yeah.
and they can also regulate that. They can also regulate their emotions. What I think about, like what that brings to my mind, because something that I'm very excited about, something that I work with all the time in my job is attachment theory. So John
Mm,
Bowlby and so on,
yeah,
and
yeah.
the others, right? Because the ideal parent-child relationship, which really doesn't exist fully in any situation, but it's the ideal.
Mm,
It doesn't have to be perfect, but it's a secure attachment.
yeah.
A child cannot regulate his or her own states, right? They cannot regulate their emotions
Mm,
necessarily. They cannot regulate the state of nervous system that's activated within them. So you, as a parent, have to help them to regulate their emotions. You have them to help them to regulate the state of their nervous system.
yeah,
And in order for you to be able to do that, you have to first regulate yourself,
yeah,
because they will mirror your state of being. And so for a parent, learning to regulate your emotions, learning to regulate your nervous system, and learning this embodiment of the fact, be in touch with yourself fully and completely, is
mm,
such a powerful learning mechanism. And what I've noticed, and this is something that I know also from the research, is that the most effective relationships when it comes to therapy or counseling or guidance are those where you, as a guide, are able to help your client to create a safe space, right?
yes,
So you become almost like that secure base from where you allow or you help your client to experience difficulties,
yeah,
whether it's internal difficulties, whether it's emotional difficulties, whether it's teaching them about the nervous system, how it works, and how you can upregulate and downregulate, and so on. Yeah.
yeah.
What What do you think about that?
Oh, absolutely. I think for me, in on the spiritual path, once I really began to to experience difficulties in parenting. That really started when we got COVID lock in, and I was alone with a 5-month-old and a 3-year-old, and realized that these were deep waters for me. I was not, in this isolation without any other adult support. Like, it was just a really big thing. I've found that the relationship potential of conscious parenting is just an extraordinary vehicle for us to work on ourselves. And I think that there is a lot of, at the minute, it's a very exciting time, at least to some extent, within a lot of the communities who are into conscious parenting, because there is beginning to be a tribe who is really, really willing to take on what it means to be perhaps even the first generations in their systems to actually learn to regulate, learn to co-regulate, understand that the frontal cortex does not come online until, it starts to have some appearance at line 7, which is the age of our older children, and then, like, by the time it matures in our 20s. And I think that's a real, for me, it's a real, I have learned a lot from my academic studies, my performance studies, but nothing like what I'm learning with my children. Nothing. No thing compares to what that journey is. And yeah, I think it's really, it is really interesting to kind of go, in some ways, how, again, you said it, and how simple it really is. Like, the key is to be safe. That's the key. And the key is to learn to be safe for ourselves, because oftentimes we didn't grow up being safe to ourselves because we didn't have a model of safety. And the key is to be safe for other people, to be safe. And I just think that it's not simple, it's not black and white, but it certainly is kind of simpler than what we make it. Because when we think of it in very simple terms, and if our manifestos and our values stand for that, if I stand for, I will be a safe person for myself, for my co-humans, for my children, for my intimate people, what does that mean? What choices am I going to have to face? What truths will I have to be honest about? Because I can choose to be in the space with somebody else, and I can choose not to be in a space with somebody else. And that's a choice we all have. But really, the responsibility of safety, the only person I can be responsible for is myself. Like, that's just on me. And so, it's an interesting thing to say. What would the world look like if people stood to that kind of a notion?
For sure.
If we could be safe for each other. That's
For sure.
that's almost sort of it's just it's so simple yet so complicated in today's world.
John Bowlby, he said, and I quote, "Life is a series of explorations from a safe base."
Yeah.
So I think that, something that you touched upon is that perhaps some of us didn't grow up having this kind of safety, not learning to be safe to ourselves, because we didn't have that significant other who was able to meet for whatever reasons. They weren't safe themselves for me, for themselves. So I never learned the patterns I never learned that when something difficult is happening within me, let's say I have a difficult emotional experience as a child, or something scary happens in my environment. It can be external or internal, something scary that triggers my nervous system. And if the response of my significant other is, or my not significant, but my primary caretaker is like not every single time, it doesn't have to be like all the time, it has to be most of the time, it has to be a pattern, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that they're also scared of it. They're
Mm.
saying that, it's not okay for you to feel this way, to have this strong reaction to your either internal or your external trigger, or sense that something is wrong or something is dangerous.
Mm.
Then I will learn that I will be scared of this. This is
Yes.
scary. So I will push it down, right? I will find a way to not be okay with this experience. Whereas if you have a parent or a significant primary caretaker who is able to be with you in that scary moment and reassure you and to tell you, see, I see that you find this to be scary. You use words to
Yeah.
describe the experience. I can see you, which is validation, and but it's not dangerous. It's not dangerous. And you will learn then, if that's repeated over and over throughout the age of the child, and like when it grows up, that child will learn, okay, the world is not scary. And I
Mm.
think also this can be different. So every child is different, right? So you can have a child who's highly sensitive, which means that simply means that, external and internal stimuli affect them much more than
Sorry.
uh, that's okay. Affect them much more harshly or intensely, perhaps,
Mm.
than, for example, another child who doesn't have a very sensitive nervous system. And so you have to adapt, obviously, and meet the child where the child is. And I think this is so important. Like my daughter, when she comes home from school, my daughters, both of them, when they come home from school, they are tired. They have been all day almost in an environment where there are almost only other kids. They have
Mm.
some adults who are able to regulate, but other kids are not able to regulate. So,
Yeah.
which means that, like, almost as if the environment that they go to in school is they depend on other kids for their own emotional regulation. It doesn't happen. So
Yeah.
they're dysregulated when they come home. So I have to, as a parent, I have to see that and I have to be able to identify that and teach them. I have to be able to be that secure base where they can have their lash outs, have their tantrums and everything, and without being scared of that.
Yeah.
And I think the client work is not so different.
Mm-hmm.
It's not very much different. I mean, it's on a different level, obviously, but
Mm-hmm.
it's similar, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's absolutely similar.
yeah,
And I also think that uh, sometimes when I've been working lately with some writers, you know, and sometimes when we are sort of trying to do something that's bigger than before, we forget that we are beginners again. Like every time I create a performance, I go through a very similar process. Years ago, that process used to lock me down. It used to maybe bring on depression and things like this when I was very young, because hadn't yet I hadn't yet had enough exposure and enough context to know what a creative process may look like. So Julia Cameron writes really beautifully that she says, the people who who are highly producing writers or very creative people, their fear, their shadow, it's not gone away. They've just learned the tools to be the space for them and do the work anyway, and do the work with those things as part of the process. So with the client work, I think it's like that. It's like somebody comes along and wants to write something or wants to advance some aspect of their relationship, and because they're at the beginning of that thing, they don't know what the thing looks like. Just like writing a PhD. We wrote PhDs, you and me. I had no idea what I was doing until it was
no,
done.
yeah. Even
Like
then, I was like,
it just
okay, what's this?
yeah, it was like the whole process was like, I have no idea. Like, just keep kind of turning up at the computer. So, and I guess the roles as a guide or a facilitator of somebody else's process is that anchor of safety, the fact that we hold space for somebody and go, this is normal. When you sit down to write something, yep, it feels like crap.
Yep,
So when those thoughts come, this is what we're going to do with them. This is how we're going to approach them. You're going to begin to have a relationship with them, and that expansion of your ability to hold that right will grow and grow and grow until one day when it will be the rare occasion or some new project or something particular that brings them out again, but they never go away. We're not, I'm not Eckhart Tolle. I'm not gonna get enlightened this life. It's not even my I'm not interested. I think this is gonna be a very human ride. And the human ride, like I said at the beginning, like it's messy. And the
It's very messy.
skill is to let it be messy and choose who you are. To choose, because that we can do. We get to
Yeah.
choose how we are in the present moment. We get to choose how we respond at the, and not 100, just like parenting, not 100%. I will fail.
Sure.
And I will get really good at dealing with failure, which will be a delightful thing. And I might have failure parties when I really screw up, and I will find my way into a life I want to live, And I think that is something that really can be facilitated by choosing to work with somebody,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Befriend your shadow,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
Simply in a sentence, befriend your shadow, and that's you changing your relationship to your struggles.
Yeah.
I have a last question before we end this,
Yeah.
and that is you touched upon the topic of spirituality. You just simply mentioned it
Mm-hmm.
on the go in the conversation. What is spirituality for you? What does it mean?
Oh, life.
Mm. Yes.
This whole thing to me is
But it's
yeah.
embodied, right?
Yeah, I just think for me it's like this is a sacred journey to me. And the more I remember how precious and sacred this is, the more I can love whatever is here. So for me, that it's like it's sacred. Like even the screaming tantrums of my children or the days that I lose my patience, like it's all sacred. It's not, there's not, uh, it's interesting. And I also kind of would say you've just gone from befriend your shadow to what is sacred. And the thing is with the shadow is that there just isn't anything terrible enough. There isn't something in there that is not a cracking open of a shimmer of light inside there. There just isn't something there that can destroy me. I probably used to feel I would be destroyed. And that's the very challenge of shadow, is that they are part of what we learned to identify as very, very dangerous and very unaccepted. But there is only an opening into light in all of our failures. So spirituality to me is not something I write morning pages and I write letters to good, GODD, because my relationship to the infinite and to spirituality, it's inseparable from this moment, from any
Yeah.
moment.
And it's highly embodied.
No. Yeah.
No? Yeah.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not
Yeah.
something that's out there, but it's very embodied. Yeah.
No, and even we were mentioning earlier on, monks that have, transformed themselves. Like, how did they do that? Through this vehicle,
Yeah.
through this thing. There is no way of even the out of body experiences are experienced through this vehicle. Like, unless you were in a human vessel, you can't have an out of body experience.
For sure.
It's not, because it's not possible. You're still that consciousness that emerges out of this system.
Yeah.
It's just impossible to have. And funnily enough, like we talk about embodiment, but of course it's impossible to be disembodied. Because
I love
even,
that. Yeah. I love
So
that because we could go on for another hour talking about the different philosophies there, right?
yeah,
Dualism in terms because most of
yeah,
Western society has been, I think, for a very long time dualistic, and people that work with with the philosophy of ideas, they all blame Descartes. I think cogito ergo sum. I don't know if he's to be blamed or if the
yeah,
experience has always been there.
yeah.
He's the where
Articulator.
everything exactly is the articulator of that experience or of that kind of thought.
Yeah,
But I remember when I studied philosophy because it was also part of my training,
yeah.
and I was working with a philosopher, and it was in theory of knowledge,
Mm,
and
mm-hmm.
we talked about René Descartes, and he said Descartes got it right the first time, but then he
Mm,
got it wrong. And he said the first time he said, which means in my thinking I am, not I think therefore I
yeah,
am. In
yeah,
my thinking is an expression of my existence. It's
yeah,
not that I think and therefore I am.
yeah, yeah,
And I think that's at least closer to my understanding of the truth.
yeah, yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Beautiful. I didn't
Yeah.
know that. I hadn't heard that.
Yeah.
Um,
Nobody knows it because everybody's just stuck with the cogito ergo sum and
yeah,
they blame
yeah.
the poor Descartes. So. Thank you so much, Karolina. If people want to get in touch with you, where can they find you?
Well, I'm on X at Karoliina Sand. I'm also on Instagram and on Facebook. You can find me at Karoliina with double
Yeah,
I, K double I, underscore Sun.
perfect. And I'll also
Sand.
put that in the in the notes
Yep.
for this episode so that people can simply click and find you there.
Great.
Truly enjoy talking to you, Karolina. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was wonderful. Thank you so much.